A pale hand breaking the freezing current of the Green River was never meant to be a greeting. In 1982, it was a visceral, desperate plea for discovery, surfacing through the mist to shatter a town's collective denial. While history often fixates on the surgical shadows of Jack the Ripper, Gary Ridgway was a master of the unremarkable. He was the employee of the month, a reliable truck painter with a predatory compulsion, hiding behind a mask of total normalcy. Welcome back to the shadows of the past. Today, we deconstruct the architecture of a nightmare and the man who turned a river into a graveyard. The discovery of those first vanished souls in the Green River didn't lead the police to a dark basement or a hidden lair. Instead, it led them to the bright, sterile floor of a truck factory. For 30 years, Gary Leon Ridgway was a ghost in plain sight at the Kenworth truck plant in Renton, Washington. To his colleagues, he wasn't a figure of dread. He was the employee of the month. He was a man of automated indifference, a meticulous worker who spent his days donning overalls and applying fresh clinical coats of paint to massive steel rigs. The air he breathed was thick with the scent of industrial thinners and paint spray, a chemical mask that successfully covered the smell of the woods and the river. This is the central paradox that would paralyze American law enforcement for 2 decades. We are conditioned by gruesome stories and vicious murders to look for a monster that looks like a monster. But Gary Ridgway looked like a pension plan. He was the unremarkable man who arrived at work at the same time every morning, did his job with quiet efficiency, and never missed a day. To the world of Kenworth, he was a steady, reliable gear in the industrial machine. At home, the mask was even more impenetrable. By the late 1980s, Ridgway was living a life that was the literal embodiment of the American dream. He was married to his third wife, Judith Mawson, a woman who would later describe him not as a predator, but as a saint. In her eyes, she hadn't married a killer. She had married the perfect partner. He was the man who brought her flowers for no reason, the man who did the dishes without being asked, and the man who held her hand in the pews of their local church every single Sunday. Imagine the scene. A man who has spent the previous night disposing of a human life in the mud of the Green River, now sitting in a sun-drenched church, singing hymns and nodding at the pastor's sermon. This wasn't just a neighborly mask. It was a total psychological immersion into normalcy. He wasn't just old Eddie, the eccentric bachelor. He was Gary, the devoted husband, the perfect neighbor who offered to help carry groceries and mow the lawn. From an editorial perspective, this is where the banality of evil becomes a forensic nightmare. In 1984, the Green River Task Force was already drowning in the sheer scale of the disappearances along Highway 99. They were looking for an unsavory character, someone who radiated the unyielding compulsion for blood. They had suspects, and they eventually had Gary Ridgway. They sat him down in a sterile interrogation room. They wired him to a polygraph machine, the gold standard of the era's investigative methods. They asked him the ultimate questions about the Green River murders. The needles, designed to jump at the slightest tremor of a guilty conscience, remained eerily flat. Gary Ridgway passed. He didn't pass because he was a criminal mastermind or a quack doctor like Crippen. He passed because his mind was a landscape of flat, emotionless logic. To Ridgway, the women he killed weren't people. They were raw materials to be discarded, no different from the scrap metal at the factory. You don't fail a lie detector test for throwing away garbage. He walked out of that police station, a free man, leaving the investigators in a state of profound frustration. This case forces us to re-examine the very nature of human evil. While the forensic science of the time was fixated on physical evidence and behavioral patterns, Ridgway was thriving in the gaps of our social perception. He exploited the fact that as a society, we tend to ignore the unpleasant parts of our world, the runaways and the sex workers who haunted the edges of the city. He realized that if he killed those that society had already forgotten, he could remain invisible as long as he kept his truck painted and his lawn mowed. For 20 years, the Green River Killer wasn't a shadow in the woods. He was the man standing next to you at the grocery store. He was the man painting the truck that passed you on the highway. He was the husband sleeping soundly next to a wife who believed she was safe. To understand how this unremarkable truck painter became the most prolific predator in history, we must look past the factory floor and the church pews. We must travel back to the roots of his deep hostility, back to a childhood where the primal hunger was first forged, not by a monster in the streets, but by the woman who raised him. The architecture of this nightmare wasn't built in a day. It was built in the shadow of a mothered voice and a world that taught a young boy that women were objects to be both desired and broken. Before the first tragic event unfolded on the banks of the Green River, the blueprint for a monster had already been drafted in the cramped, suffocating rooms of the Ridgway household. To see the moment the rot first set in, we have to look past the painted trucks of the 1980s and into the poisoned soil of Gary's childhood. The primary architect of this psychological ruin was his mother, Mary Ridgway. In the annals of criminal psychology, we often see mothers who are either neglectful or fanatically religious, but Mary was something far more complex. She was a woman of explosive, iron-willed authority who maintained a strange, inappropriate control over her sons. The most visceral example of this mother's poison occurred during Gary's adolescence. Like many children of high-stress households, Gary struggled with bedwetting well into his teenage years. In a normal home, this would be handled with medical care or quiet patience. But in the house of Mary Ridgway, it became a ritual of humiliation and bizarre intimacy. She didn't just punish him. She would physically wash his most private areas herself, a violation of boundaries that left Gary in a state of perpetual psychological confusion. He was taught to both fear her and be inappropriately conditioned by her authority. From an editorial perspective, this created a profound, dark obsession and a deep-seated hostility. Gary began to view women as figures that needed to be conquered or eliminated to regain the power his mother had stripped away. His father, Thomas, didn't help. He was a man who frequently complained and shouted about the vulnerable street workers who walked the edges of their neighborhood, branding them as trash and garbage. This was the inheritance Gary Ridgway received: a mother who dominated him inappropriately, and a father who taught him that certain women were subhuman objects. By the time he was 16, the transformation had begun. He didn't just have dark thoughts. He sought out the visceral sensation of inflicting harm. He once lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and critically injured him just to see what it felt like to take a life. The boy survived, but the predator inside, Gary, had been fed for the first time. But psychological trauma alone does not explain how Gary Ridgway became the most prolific serial offender in American history. In the realm of forensic science, we often look for the genius predator, the Ted Bundy figure with a high IQ and a silver tongue. Gary Ridgway was a profound statistical outlier. He possessed an IQ of approximately 80, a level that borders on intellectual disability. He struggled with severe dyslexia, had to repeat grades in school, and was often viewed by his peers as slow or unremarkable. Yet, this low IQ predator managed to outsmart the FBI, the local task force, and some of the best forensic minds in the world for over 20 years. How? The answer lies in the automated indifference nature of his brain. Because he wasn't burdened by the ego or the complex fantasies of a high IQ offender, Ridgway operated with the cold, repetitive consistency of a machine. He didn't try to be clever. He was simply thorough. He treated taking a life with the same utilitarian indifference he applied to painting trucks at the factory. His low intelligence was actually a specialized survival mechanism. He didn't overthink his actions. He followed a simple, brutal logic. Find a woman no one would miss, take her to a place no one was looking, and use a method, the manual physical hold, that left no forensic trail. While investigators were looking for a complex crime with a complex signature, Ridgway was just repeating a successful work order over and over again. This banality of evil allowed him to bypass the standard psychological profiles of the time. The FBI was looking for a man who wanted to play cat and mouse with the law. They weren't looking for a man who was essentially a biological machine designed for hunting. His street smarts were honed not by books, but by a lifetime of existing on the margins. He knew the geography of the Green River like the back of his hand. He knew which parts of the woods were never visited by hunters, and he knew exactly how to blend into the gray industrial mist of the Pacific Northwest. By the late 1970s, the architect of hostility had finished his education. He had the trauma to drive him and the mechanical consistency to protect him. All he needed was a hunting ground, a place where society's unsavory characters were discarded and ignored. The stage was set. The Green River was waiting. And as the 1980s began, the reliable factory hand was about to turn Highway 99 into a tragic dark zone that would leave the world of forensic science in a state of total, paralyzed shock. The psychological rot forged in Gary's childhood didn't just stay in his mind. It found a physical home along the asphalt veins of Washington state. By 1982, Highway 99, known locally as the Strip, had become the primary hunting ground for a predator that society refused to see. This was an era where a whole new world of industrial growth was being ushered in. Yet, on the margins of the Pacific Northwest, some rather unsavory characters were making their way into the shadows. The Strip was a landscape of rain-slicked asphalt, neon signs flickering through the mist, and a steady stream of girls who had fallen through the cracks of the American dream. From an editorial perspective, we must examine the social indifference that allowed Gary Ridgway to thrive. The victims were runaways, sex workers, and those abandoned by the system, the kind of people the local community often viewed as garbage. Because society had already decided these women were disposable, Gary realized he could make them disappear without triggering the alarm bells of a standard murder investigation. He was a master of exploiting the blind spots of 1980s morality. His method was a terrifying blend of mundane charm and mechanical efficiency. He would pull his truck alongside these women, his face wearing that shy, employee of the month grin. To lower their guard, he utilized a prop of profound innocence, a photograph of his young son. He would show them the picture, casting himself as the neighborly single father just looking for companionship. This use of a child's image to facilitate a brutal homicide murder is perhaps the ultimate betrayal of human trust. It was a psychological mask that allowed a monster to look like a man just trying to get by. Once they were inside the cab of his truck, the neighborly mask was discarded. Gary didn't use the loud, dramatic violence of a cinematic villain. He chose the silent, mechanical precision of the chokehold. From behind, he would wrap his arm around their necks, cutting off the air with the same clinical indifference he used when applying paint to a truck chassis. There was no noise, no blood, and no struggle that would alert a passerby on the busy highway. By the time the lights of the next diner passed by, the woman in the passenger seat was no longer a human being. She had become raw material to be discarded in the Green River. This was the peak of his power. Between 1982 and 1984, Gary Ridgway was a biological machine, operating with a frequency that would eventually baffle forensic minds. He was turning the lush green landscape of Washington into a killing field, yet he remained invisible because he looked like everyone else. He was the man painting the rigs that kept the country moving, while secretly filling the river with the vanished souls of the Strip. But for Gary Ridgway, the silence of the woods after a murder wasn't a conclusion. It was merely a pause. As we deconstruct the architecture of his nightmare, we encounter a level of depravity that shifts the case from a savage homicide investigation into a study of the profound abyss. Gary didn't just kill. He became a scavenger of the remains he had created. This is where the Necrophile's ritual begins, a series of nightly excursions that revealed his true view of his victims as inanimate objects. He would return to the burial sites in the weeks and months following a murder. In the freezing, damp darkness of the Pacific Northwest woods, he would exhume the bodies he had hidden under layers of ferns and mud. He wasn't looking for a gruesome story or a trophy. He was looking to satisfy an unyielding compulsion for ownership. To Gary Ridgway, a corpse was the perfect partner, someone who could never talk back, never judge, and never leave. From a psychological standpoint, his twisted logic was rooted in a cold, utilitarian efficiency. When investigators later asked him why he returned to the bodies, his answer reflected the mind of a factory worker, not a criminal mastermind. He claimed that by returning to his old victims, he was saving money. It was easier than finding a new girl, he would whisper. It didn't cost anything, and it was safer than hunting on the Strip. This is the visceral reality of the Green River Killer. He viewed human life with the same disposable mindset as a used part in a Kenworth engine. He would engage in sexual acts with the deceased, sometimes for hours, in the middle of a forest that felt as silent as a tomb. He would take their jewelry, their clothes, and even their personal items, not to keep as memories, but to repurpose them, sometimes even giving the stolen items to his own wives. The shock value here is not just in the act of necrophilia, but in the total erasure of the victim's humanity. By returning to the bodies, Gary was attempting to maintain a permanent collection of objects that he owned completely. He was a collector of the dead, tending to his secret graveyard with the same meticulous care he gave to his garden at home. This ritual of resurrection through possession is what allowed him to maintain his neighborly mask during the day. He had a world of his own in the woods, a world where he was the absolute authority, a world that made his mundane life at the truck factory bearable. This part of the case is what truly disturbed forensic profilers like Ted Bundy, who would eventually consult on the case. They realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a man who lived in the gaps between life and death. Ridgway's ability to move between the warmth of his marriage and the cold rot of his burial sites is a testament to a mind that had completely fractured. The Necrophile's ritual is the ultimate editorial on the fragility of the human soul. It shows a man who had become so detached from the concept of human dignity that he viewed a graveyard as a playground. As the body count rose and the Sash Green River began to yield its pale secrets, the authorities were still looking for a man with a vicious signature. They didn't realize they were dealing with a scavenger who was continually tending to his own gruesome inventory. The Pacific Northwest was no longer just an emerald sanctuary. It had become a warehouse of the deceased, maintained by a man who looked like the perfect husband. But as the investigation into the Green River murders entered its most frustrated phase, the reliable factory hand was about to face a challenge that even his robotic consistency logic couldn't avoid. The world of forensic science was changing, and the perfect neighbor was about to leave a trail that would take 20 years to decode. The failure of the polygraph in May 1984 didn't just allow a killer to walk free, it sent the entire Green River Task Force into a state of psychological paralysis. In the mid-1980s, law enforcement was attempting to usher in a new era of scientific investigation. The polygraph was the gold standard, a technological marvel that was supposed to bridge the gap between human intuition and forensic certainty. When Gary Ridgway was brought into that sterile interrogation room, the air was thick with the scent of coffee and desperation. The detectives were looking for the unyielding compulsion of a monster. They were looking for a man whose biological systems would betray him under the pressure of his ruthless killings. They wired Ridgway to the machine, the sensors wrapping around his chest and fingertips like a digital web. They asked him the baseline questions. Then they moved toward the abyss. They asked him about the girls from the strip, about the bodies surfacing in the mud of the Green River, about the specific visceral details of the killings. The investigators watched the paper feed, waiting for the jagged peaks of a guilty heart. But the result was a profound polygraph paradox. The needles remained eerily, mockingly flat. Gary Ridgway passed with the clinical ease of a man answering questions about the weather. From an editorial perspective, we have to deconstruct why the machine failed so spectacularly. It wasn't because Ridgway was a criminal mastermind like Dr. Crippen. It was because the polygraph is designed to measure a human conscience, the biological stress of a soul that knows it is lying. Gary Ridgway simply did not possess one. His brain operated with the cold, mechanical logic of the truck factory where he worked. To him, the women he killed were no different from the chassis he painted every day, discarded parts to be moved through a process. You don't fail a lie detector test for throwing away garbage. His low intelligence, often dismissed by others as a weakness, became his ultimate fortress. He didn't have the imagination to feel fear, and he didn't have the empathy to feel guilt. The machine was looking for a monster who knew he was a monster. Instead, it was testing a failed machine of a man who viewed himself as a reliable, unremarkable neighbor. This moment in the investigation highlights the terrifying fallibility of early forensic tools. Because the machine said he was innocent, the police were forced to let him go. The most prolific serial killer in American history walked out of that station and vanished back into plain sight, protected by a technology that was supposed to expose him. While the authorities were wrestling with the failure of their science, Gary Ridgway was returning to the killing fields with a renewed sense of invisibility. He wasn't just surviving the investigation, he was actively manipulating it through a series of red herrings that were as simple as they were effective. He viewed himself as a fisherman of humans, a scavenger who understood that the best way to hide a vicious murder was to create a landscape of false leads. Ridgway's counterforensics were born not from textbooks, but from a primitive hunting instinct. He realized that the Metropolitan Police were looking for physical evidence, for DNA, for hair, for fibers that would build a scientific case against him. So, he began to provide it. He would frequent public places, diners and bus stations along Highway 99, meticulously collecting the trash of unsavory characters. He would pick up discarded cigarette butts and chewed gum left by strangers, keeping them in his truck like a morbid collection of lures. When he returned to his burial sites in the woods, he would sprinkle these items around the bodies. He was intentionally polluting the crime scene, creating a forensic nightmare. Imagine the frustration of the investigators finding a thumbprint or a DNA sample that led them to a man who had never even been to the true Green River. Ridgway was crafting a labyrinth of dead ends, keeping the task force chasing their own shadows while he continued his unyielding compulsion in the dark. But his most effective tactic was the manipulation of jurisdiction. He understood that the borders between counties and states were also borders between police databases. He began to move his victims across state lines, dumping bodies in Oregon or in distant, rugged parts of Washington. In the 1980s, the police force was still fragmented. A body found in one county might not be linked to a disappearance in another for months or years. Ridgway exploited this failed machine of communication. By scattering his victims like industrial debris across the Pacific Northwest, he made it impossible for investigators to see the gruesome stories as a single, connected narrative. He was a man of low IQ, but his hunting skills were unmatched. He treated the entire state like a vast factory floor, moving parts until the inventory was impossible to track. This period of the investigation was a true investigative abyss. The authorities had his name, they had his truck, and they had even had him in the chair. Yet, through a combination of primitive cunning and the fallibility of modern tools, Gary Ridgway remained the ghost in the machine. He had turned the neighborly mask into an impenetrable fortress. The hunt had reached a state of total stagnation. The police were out of leads and out of hope. But in the depths of this darkness, a voice was about to emerge from the silence of death row. A voice that understood the monster because it shared the same insatiable desire. While the Green River Task Force was navigating a landscape of dead ends and failed technology, an unexpected voice emerged from the shadows of death row, offering a window into the mind of a predator that no polygraph could ever provide. In 1984, the most notorious serial killer in American history, Ted Bundy, was awaiting the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Despite being thousands of miles away from the rain-slicked streets of Washington, Bundy was following the gruesome stories of the Green River murders with an insatiable desire for the details. He realized that the Metropolitan Police were fundamentally misunderstanding the man they were hunting. In a surreal turn of events, the authorities decided to recruit one monster to catch another. The detectives, Robert Keppel and Dave Reichert, sat across from Bundy in a sterile, high-security visitation room. The atmosphere was thick with a chilling irony. A decade earlier, Keppel had been the man hunting Bundy. Now, he was the student, and Bundy was the professor. Bundy didn't offer information for money or leniency. He offered it for the chance to feel relevant, to prove that his vicious murders had given him a Ph.D. in the mechanics of the abyss. Through the recorded transcripts, we can reconstruct the dialogue of this macabre consultation. Bundy, leaning forward with an authoritative, almost arrogant calm, began to dismantle the task force's profile. "You're looking for a man who is hunting," Bundy whispered, his voice smooth and analytical. "But you're missing the most vital part of his ritual. You think he dumps the bodies and vanishes. He doesn't." He paused, looking directly at the investigators. "He's going back. He's visiting the grave sites because they belong to him now. He's spending time with them. He's taking trophies, yes, but more importantly, he's indulging in the possession. If you want to catch the Green River killer, you don't wait on the strip. You wait at the bodies." This was the Bundy prediction, the realization that the killer was likely practicing necrophilia. In the realm of forensic science in the 1980s, this was a radical and deeply disturbing suggestion. The authorities couldn't believe that a man could be so unremarkable during the day and so profoundly depraved at night. But Bundy wasn't guessing. He was describing himself. He recognized the insatiable desire for ownership that defined Gary Ridgway, because it was the same fire that had burned within him. Only a monster could truly recognize a monster. Bundy explained that the killer would return to the raw materials to satisfy a need for power that the initial murder couldn't fulfill. He predicted that the killer would groom the sites, move the remains, and even engage in sexual acts with the deceased to maintain the illusion of a relationship. From an editorial perspective, this is the ultimate twist in the Green River narrative. The most advanced investigative methods of the time had failed, yet the key to understanding the killer's M.O. was provided by a man sitting in a cage on the other side of the country. Bundy's insights were terrifyingly accurate. He understood that Ridgway viewed his victims as objects that could be repurposed and revisited. However, despite Bundy's forensic brilliance, the failed machine of the investigation was too slow to act. The task force attempted to stake out some of the burial sites, but Ridgway's primitive hunting instincts were too sharp. He sensed the presence of the authorities and began to diversify his dumping grounds, moving further into the rugged wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The consultation with Ted Bundy provided the psychological blueprint, but it didn't provide the name. The Devil's Consultant had confirmed that the police were dealing with a scavenger of the dead. Yet, Gary Ridgway continued to punch his time card at the Kenworth factory every morning. As the 1980s drew to a close, the vicious murders along Highway 99 began to slow down. To the public, it seemed as though the Green River killer had simply vanished into the mist. But in reality, the predator wasn't gone. he was entering a state of hibernation. The primal hunger hadn't disappeared. It had been sublimated into the life of a perfect husband. While the world forgot the vanished souls of the Strip, Gary Ridgway was about to begin his most successful act of deception yet, living a life of total domestic saintliness, with a woman who had no idea she was sleeping next to the most prolific killer in history. The strategic insights provided by Ted Bundy may have illuminated the dark mechanics of the killer's mind, but for the investigators on the ground, the trail had grown cold, buried under the domestic bliss of a man who had decided to become a saint. As the 1980s drew to a close, the frantic hunt for the Sioux Green River killer entered a state of profound hibernation. While the families of the vanished souls were left in a vacuum of grief, Gary Leon Ridgway was busy constructing a new impenetrable fortress, the life of the perfect husband. In 1988, Ridgway married his third wife, Judith Mawson, and for the next 13 years, he would inhabit a reality that defied every known category of serial depravity. To understand the terrifying nature of his double life, we must look at Gary through the eyes of Judith. In her world, she hadn't married a man with an unending cycle of violence for death. She had married a man who was her rock, her provider, and her greatest support. She later described him not as a monster, but as a saint. He was the husband who brought her flowers for no reason, the man who would hold her hand tightly in public, and the devoted partner who spent his weekends helping her with chores and attending church. From an editorial perspective, this is where the banality of evil reaches its most heartbreaking peak. We are conditioned by gruesome stories to expect killers to be outsiders, loners who skulk in the dark. But Ridgway was the man sitting at the dinner table, laughing at his wife's jokes while the remains of dozens of women were still decomposing in the mud of the Green River just a few miles away. He had mastered the facade of normalcy so completely that he wasn't just fooling the police. He was fooling the woman who slept next to him every night. But behind the hand-holding and the church pews, the predator was merely dormant, not dead. While Judith believed her husband was working overtime at the Kenworth truck factory or picking up supplies for his painting projects, Ridgway was actually maintaining his secret graveyard. His marriage didn't stop his urge to kill. It sublimated it. Psychologically, Gary's relationship with Judith provided him with the power and control he had been denied in his childhood. By being the perfect husband to a woman who adored him, he was able to satisfy a portion of his ego that had previously only been fed by violence. However, the vicious murders didn't stop entirely. They simply became more calculated, more spaced out. He was no longer a biological machine operating at a frantic pace. He was a husband who would occasionally go for a drive to satisfy a lingering itch. And it was during these years that he committed perhaps his most visceral acts of betrayal. One of the most disturbing details revealed later was Ridgway's habit of handling the jewelry and personal items of his victims. While Judith remained unaware, Gary would return home with rings, necklaces, and trinkets taken from the dead. In a display of profound indifference, he would sometimes give these items to Judith as gifts, or he would hide them in plain sight among her own belongings. He was literally dressing his wife in the trophies of his dark obsession. When he wasn't gifting the loot, he was repurposing it. He would take the stolen jewelry to flea markets or secondhand shops, selling the memories of vanished souls for a few dollars. To him, these items weren't symbols of a human life. They were industrial surplus, parts to be sold or traded once the raw material was discarded. This utilitarian view of his victims as mere objects is what allowed him to sleep soundly. He didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a man who was simply cleaning up the streets and providing for his family. For 13 years, the Green River Killer was a ghost in a suburban living room. While the task force was being dismantled due to a lack of progress, the primary suspect was living a life of total domestic saintliness. The frustration for law enforcement was absolute. In 1987, the police had actually taken samples of Gary's hair and saliva. They had the physical evidence that would eventually convict him sitting in a freezer. But the realm of forensic science was not yet ready to decode the miracle of DNA. So, Gary Ridgway waited. He painted his trucks. He loved his wife. He went to church. And occasionally he revisited the woods to spend time with the objects he had collected. From an editorial standpoint, this period is a terrifying reminder of how easily the truth can be buried under the weight of normalcy. Judith Mawson's betrayal was not a lack of intuition. It was a testament to Ridgway's terrifying ability to compartmentalize his soul. He had created a world where he was a saint, and he lived in that world so convincingly that he almost believed it himself. But as the calendar turned to the new millennium, the hibernation was about to be violently interrupted. The technological world was finally catching up to the predator's trail. The hair and saliva samples taken in 1987, the fragments of Gary Ridgway that had been frozen in time, were about to speak for the victims who had been silenced. The miracle of science was about to collide with the perfect husband. The neighborly mask was about to be ripped away, not by a detective's hunch, but by the microscopic truth found in a single strand of hair. The ghost in the living room was about to be exposed. The domestic saintliness that defined Gary Ridgway's life for over a decade was not a redemption, but a temporary stay of execution. Granted only because the world of forensic science was still waiting for its greatest miracle. For nearly 20 years, the investigation into the Green River murders had been a monument to human frustration. The task force had been dismantled, the files had gathered dust, and the primary suspect had vanished into the quiet routine of suburban life. But in a sterile freezer in a Washington state crime lab, fragments of the predator were waiting in a state of suspended animation. In 1987, detectives had taken samples of Gary's hair and saliva. At the time, these were merely biological artifacts, useless against the limited technology of the late 80s. But science, unlike human memory, never forgets. Just as the metropolitan police of the early 20th century were forced to abandon the clunky measurements of the Bertillon system for the revolutionary precision of fingerprints, the investigators of the new millennium were about to witness a shift that would rewrite the history of criminology. By 2001, the realm of forensic science had entered the era of STR, short tandem repeat, DNA profiling. This was no longer about broad blood types or vague hair comparisons. This was about the genetic signature, the microscopic, undeniable truth that exists in every cell of the human body. In late 2001, the lab technicians at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab began the process of re-examining the cold cases that had haunted the region for decades. They turned their attention to the samples taken from Gary Ridgway 14 years earlier. The process was clinical, methodical, and entirely devoid of the neighborly mask that Gary had used to fool the world. Under the microscope, there were no "the man with the spotless work record" plaques and no church pews. There was only the biological reality of a predator. The moment the match was confirmed, the investigative abyss finally bottomed out. The DNA from the 1987 saliva sample was an identical match to the genetic material found on several of the earliest victims, including Wendy Caulfield and Marcia Chapman. The loop that had begun on the banks of the Green River in 1982 was finally closing. It wasn't a detective's hunch or a witness's statement that broke the case. It was the miracle of science, bridging a 20-year gap with the absolute authority of a genetic code. From an editorial perspective, this is the ultimate triumph of the scientific approach that started to build Scotland Yard's international reputation a century prior. Time had been Gary Ridgway's greatest ally, allowing him to bury his vicious murders under a layer of domestic respectability. But DNA turned time into a trap. The very samples he had provided, thinking himself invincible after passing a polygraph, had become the silent witnesses that would lead him to the end of his road. November 30th, 2001. The ticking clock of the investigation reached its final second. The setting for the arrest was not a dark alley or a remote burial site. It was the Kenworth truck factory, the very place where A. Gary Ridgway had maintained his saintly image for over 30 years. It was a cold, rainy Friday afternoon. Gary had just finished his shift, perhaps still smelling of the industrial paint and chemicals that had served as his camouflage for so long. He walked out of the factory gates, likely thinking about the weekend ahead with Aunt Judith, unaware that a fleet of unmarked police cruisers was about to descend upon him. The arrest was as clinical and unremarkable as the man himself. There was no high-speed chase, no dramatic struggle, and no vicious display of resistance. When the officers stepped out of the shadows and identified themselves, Gary Ridgway simply went quiet. The neighborly mask didn't slip. It simply went hollow. As the handcuffs clicked around the wrists of the most prolific serial killer in American history, the banality of evil was on full display. He looked like exactly what he had claimed to be, a tired, aging factory worker. While the news of the arrest sent a shockwave through the Pacific Northwest, the most profound reaction was felt inside the Ridgway home. Judith Mawson, the woman who believed she had married a saint, watched as her reality was systematically dismantled by the forensic truth. The man who brought her flowers and held her hand in church was now being linked to the gruesome stories that had defined the region's nightmares for 2 decades. This is the terrifying power of forensic science. It doesn't just catch the killer, it forces us to confront the unsavory characters we have allowed into our lives. The Green River Killer wasn't caught by a dramatic twist in a courtroom. He was caught in a lab by a technician who saw through the man with the spotless work record to the biological monster beneath. But the arrest was only the beginning of the final act. Gary Ridgway was now a captive of the system he had outsmarted for so long. And as the authorities prepared for the interrogation that would follow, they realized that the DNA had only revealed the name. To find the vanished souls that were still missing, they would have to enter a plea and pardon negotiation that would test the very limits of human justice. The miracle of science had provided the what and the who. Now the world was waiting for the how many. The microscopic truth of DNA had pinned Gary Ridgway to the wall. But for the prosecution, the victory was only partial. They had the man, but they didn't have the map to his graveyard. In 2003, the King County Prosecutor's Office faced a choice that would test the very foundations of the justice system. They could pursue the death penalty for the few murders proven by modern science, or they could make a deal with the devil. To provide closure to the families of the vanished souls, the state offered a plea agreement. In exchange for his life, Gary Ridgway would have to lead the police to every woman he had ever discarded in the Pacific Northwest. The subsequent months were descent into a literal geography of death. The Employee of the Month was taken out of his cell and into the rugged ravines and dense forests he had used as his private warehouse. Tethered to investigators, Gary Ridgway walked through the mud with the same mechanical indifference he had shown on the factory floor. He didn't point with regret. He pointed with the clinical utility of a man doing a final inventory of his garbage. "She's over there, under that log," he would whisper, his voice flat and devoid of any visceral emotion. "I think I put 2 of them in this ravine. No. Wait. That was the raw material I moved from the strip." From a forensic standpoint, the scale of the desecration was staggering. As Ridgway spoke, the biological inventory of Washington State grew to impossible proportions. He led them to skeletal remains that had been hidden for 20 years. Women whose families had long since abandoned the hope of a proper burial. He remembered the geography not by the names of the victims, but by the landmarks of his own hunting rituals. The final tally of the plea was a grim forensic listing. Gary Ridgway confessed to 48 murders, a number that immediately made him the most prolific serial killer in American history. On December 18th, 2003, he stood before a judge and received 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 480 years for good measure. The neighborly mask was gone, replaced by a legal reality that ensured he would never see the sun as a free man again. But as the sentences were read, the courtroom was filled with a tension that no legal verdict could resolve. The coldness of Ridgway's confession had left a void in the hearts of the families, a void that was about to be filled by an act of grace so unexpected it would shatter the monster's internal machine. The sentencing hearing was a theater of justifiable rage. For hours, the families of the victims stood just feet away from Gary Ridgway, pouring out decades of accumulated venom. Mothers screamed for his soul to burn in hell. Fathers shook with a vicious desire for vengeance, calling him a coward, a parasite, and a subhuman machine. Through it all, Ridgway sat perfectly still. He wore the same hollow, unremarkable expression he had practiced for 30 years. He looked at them with the same indifference he had shown the skeletal remains in the woods. To Gary Ridgway, their pain was just another industrial byproduct he didn't need to process. But then the room went silent as Robert Rule took the stand. Robert Rule was the father of Linda Rule, a young woman who had vanished into the Pacific Northwest mist in 1982. He was an elderly man, his voice trembling not with rage, but with a profound, weary sadness. He didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the posters of the young girls lining the walls. He looked directly at the man who had murdered his daughter. "Mr. Ridgway," Robert said, the silence in the courtroom becoming deafening. "There are people here who hate you. They have every right to, but I am not one of them. You see, I am a man of faith, and my faith teaches me that I must forgive. So, I want you to know that you are forgiven." The impact was instantaneous and visceral. The man who had passed a polygraph while describing vicious murders, the man who had coolly led police to 48 graveyards, finally broke. The mechanical logic of his brain, which was built to withstand hatred and interrogation, had no defense against the weapon of grace. For the first and only time in the entire 20-year investigation, Gary Ridgway's face crumpled. A single visible tear escaped his eye and rolled down his cheek. He began to sob, his body shaking under the weight of a realization he couldn't name. The unfeeling machine had been rebooted by a simple, profound act of human mercy. From an editorial perspective, this is the ultimate twist in the Green River narrative. We often believe that the only way to hurt a monster is through a greater violence. But Ridgway was a creature of violence. He understood it. He spoke its language. What he didn't understand was the human capacity for forgiveness. Robert Rule had reached into the abyss and touched the only fragment of a soul that Gary Ridgway had left. The vicious murders had ended in a courtroom, not with a scream of vengeance, but with the quiet, devastating power of a father's grace. It was a powerful emotional punchline to a 20-year nightmare, leaving the world with a lingering question about the nature of human evil and the light that dares to confront it. The courtroom tears of Gary Ridgway may have provided a final human footnote to this tragedy, but they didn't wash away the 2 decades of blood in the Green River. This case forces us to confront a visceral, uncomfortable truth. Our monsters don't always look like monsters. We are conditioned to look for outcasts or unsavory characters skulking in the dark, but Ridgway was the master of the unremarkable. He was the employee of the month who never missed a shift. He was the saintly husband who held his wife's hand in church every Sunday. He proved that the most prolific killer in American history didn't live in a hidden lair. He lived in a suburban house with a perfectly mown lawn. From an editorial perspective, Ridgway wasn't a genius. He was a machine. He viewed human beings as raw materials to be discarded and exploited the very social blind spots we use to protect our own peace of mind. He targeted those society chose to ignore, and he hid behind the neighborly mask we are conditioned to trust. As the mist settles over the Pacific Northwest tonight, the vicious murders are over, but the paranoia remains. Gary Ridgway is now just a number in a prison ledger, but the warning he leaves behind is eternal. The most terrifying predators don't live in our closets. They live right next door, offering to help you carry your groceries while they wait for their moment to step into the void. The miracle of DNA finally spoke the truth. But as you walk to your front door tonight, one question should linger in the cold air. How well do you really know the man waving at you from across the street? Thanks for sticking with us through this deep dive. What case should we deconstruct next? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next investigation.